Hello and welcome to the Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. I was going to say the 100th episode of the Ancient Warfare podcast, but we're way past that. But we are discussing the 100th issue of Ancient Warfare Magazine, so that's why I had my wires crossed. My name is Jasper Oorthuis, and I'm the editor of Ancient Warfare Magazine. And with me today are Murray Dahm, the assistant editor, Mark McCaffrey, and Mark DeSantis. And as I said, we're going to discuss the 100th issue of the magazine, which is about to come out. I mean, the digital readers already have their copy, and print copy will be released probably as this podcast is released. And the issue is all about single combat, which we thought sort of closed the circle nicely because the introductory brochure had an article by Ross Cohen, which also discussed the benefits of having scars and single combat, and Ross has written in this issue as well. So we've, thought that tied it nicely into a bow. There's lots to discuss about single combat, and Mark tells me that he has a controversial take on Livy in this respect. So, Mark, take it away.
And it concerns the Spolia Opima. Livy in 419, book 4, chapter 19 and chapter 20, devotes considerable space to the Spolia Opima and a controversy he came across. The single combats included Aulus Cornelius Cassus, who, as a military tribune in 437 BC, defeated an enemy general, and also a single combat which was won by Marcus Licinius Crassus, the grandson of the triumvir of the same name. First, let's define a term. Spolia Opima, it meant either bountiful spoils or possibly supreme spoils. And the spoils were the weapons and armor taken from an enemy general, won in single combat by a Roman. This was an award, the highest that a Roman warrior might obtain, and they could thereafter be deposited in the temple of Jupiter Feretrius in the city of Rome by the victorious general. Right? More about whether it was necessary to have always been a general. The temple is said to have been the very first one built in the city, but its whereabouts are no longer known. It's judged to have once stood on the Capitoline Hill. The first dedicator of Spolia Opima, according to Roman legend, was none other than Romulus himself. The second was the aforementioned Aulus Cornelius Cassus, a cavalryman who slew the Etruscan king of Veii, Lars Volumnius, at the Battle of Fidenae in 437 BC, and you can read about this in Livy 419. The actual general directing the Roman army at that time was the dictator Mamercus Aemilius. Livy writes that Cassus dedicated the Spolia Opima in the temple of Jupiter Feretrius at the time of the ensuing triumph of Mamercus Aemilius. Here's where Cassus's status at the time of the Battle of Fidenae becomes critical. He was clearly not in command of the Roman army there. Mamercus Aemilius was. Therefore, it may rightly be stated that Cassus was not a general and not fighting under his own religious auspices. In Book 420, Livy writes that he has followed all earlier authorities who say that Cassus was a military tribune at the time that he dedicated the Spolia Opima in the temple. Then Livy brings up a controversy as to what office Cassus actually held at this time. Even though sources available to him, Livy said, all the sources available to Livy say that he was a tribune, Livy notes that Augustus, who had rebuilt the ancient temple that had fallen into near ruin, had himself gone inside and discovered that the inscription on the linen corselet placed therein indicated that Cassus was actually a consul, which is above a tribune. Livy appears to have had to backpedal after the first version of his history had been written for political reasons. At around this time, meaning the latter 1st century BC, Augustus was busy solidifying the foundations of his new regime. Inconveniently for him, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the grandson of the triumvir of the same name, had defeated Deldo, the chieftain of the Bastarnae, in single combat in battle in Thrace in 29 BC. And you can look at Dio Cassius 51.24 for this. Proud of his deed, Crassus wished to dedicate the Spolia Opima in the temple of Jupiter Feretrius. Now, just prior to this, there'd only been three other dedicators of Spolia Opima. There had been Romulus, there had been Aulus Cornelius Cassus, and Marcus Claudius Marcellus, who had dedicated it after killing Viridomarus in 222 BC, shortly before the outbreak of the Second Punic War. But Augustus refused Crassus this honor. Crassus, who had been consul of Rome in 30 BC, was now simply a proconsul of Macedonia, and thus was not fighting under his own auspices, but Augustus's, since Augustus was himself the commander-in-chief of Roman forces at this time, not Crassus. There is no doubt, however, that Crassus was the general in command of the army in Thrace. This problem of Cassus's status is also why Cassus had to be reclassified as a consul to make him politically superior to a proconsul, as had been Crassus, so that Augustus could claim that Crassus did not do battle under his own religious auspices. Augustus must have refused the Spolia Opima on the grounds that he was worried about allowing someone else outside of his trusted circle to be a military hero, especially at the inception of his regime. This is almost certainly why Crassus was denied the honor of imperator, which means commander, which Augustus claimed for himself. So Livy himself oozes skepticism about what is Augustus's official line on the Cassus matter, even though he has to tread carefully when writing about it. So it may be presumed that in the course of reporting Cassus's single combat and the dedication of the Spolia Opima, which no one in Rome had ever thought to deny, that Augustus took issue with an aspect of Livy's prior written version in light of the contemporaneous defeat of Deldo in single combat by Marcus Licinius Crassus. And this thesis has been put forward by the German scholar Hermann Dessau in 1906. Livy must have learned of Augustus's discomfiture and fall into line with the wishes of Augustus, even if he presents what evidence he had without coming down decisively either way on it. So that's my take on the whole question of single combats and whether or not Spolia Opima was actually due to Marcus Licinius Crassus. I think it should have been given to him, but for political reasons, it had to be denied.
I think it's interesting because later, like on Trajan's column, where you get the cavalry decurion telling us in his inscription, which isn't mentioned in any literary source, that he captures Decebalus, and then it's shown, but it's presented to Trajan. So it's almost like that whole idea of this is what you claim when you do this deed is completely forgotten. And it's no longer you don't even try and claim the Spolia Opima after that point. So it's sort of like it's taken out of the repertoire of ways of identifying heroic conduct.
The award could only belong to the imperial house and no one else. And that's why triumphs also fall by the wayside if you're not an actual emperor.
Yeah, which I think is that framework rather than which is the technicality of like the emperor's holding auspicia over the army, which is what we talked about off camera, being the important factor of it and not allowing a lesser non-imperial commander to erode that authority in the public's eye, I suppose.
It makes complete sense that Augustus is very worried about that early in his reign, of course. And he makes it very clear, and like on the Res Gestae inscription, it's my army, my fleet. I'm at the head, and everybody else is just doing whatever they're doing at my behest.
My bidding.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And when you consider how much trouble the empire suffered later on, especially in the 3rd century when victorious generals were declared to be emperors by their own armies, that this fear was not unfounded. It was not an irrational fear.
Augustus is doing something that is long tradition in terms of rewriting the history books. You mentioned there that he's done the repairs or renovations for the temple of Jupiter Feretrius on the Capitoline, and of course that goes back to traditionally speaking, a lot of the temples in Rome were dedicated by families, especially as triumphal monuments, manubial temples as they were known, and subsequently the families would then have pass on responsibility for keeping up management and maintenance of those temples. And then sometimes that could be superseded by different branches of the family. Augustus is just coming in and, you know, taking that responsibility on. But with it comes the passing down of history, because for sources like Livy, he's working his history based on his own sources, which are coming a lot of the time from family histories and from monuments that are maintained by families. So subsequently, you know, for Augustus to be waltzing in there and perhaps meddling with the inscriptions wouldn't be that unusual, really, in Roman traditions.
And even the subversion of history. I mean, for me, the most interesting one is Sulla claiming credit as a tribune, I think he is, for the defeat of Jugurtha. You're like, you're under Marius's command. You're not claiming that. You're doing that later when you're writing your own autobiography and you're trying to take credit away from Marius, who's been discredited. But there's no way at the time you're taking credit for something you did under the auspices of your general. But then that rewriting becomes the source for Plutarch, and it becomes the source for others, even Sallust. So very often we're not given the full picture. We're only given one version of the picture, which is what makes Livy's discussion of it so interesting, because we're getting a glimpse into the alternate version that was meant to be suppressed. You know, and it's interesting when you do get these usurpers, and it's not just the 3rd century. Any usurper is declared by their army, you know, even against their will, which is kind of like, you know, they were reluctant. It was like, well, yeah, but you've got no choice because we've just declared you emperor, so you're emperor now. They don't then go, right, well, I'll give myself a triumph. I'll give myself a Spolia Opima. There's almost like when they're declared emperor, they have to secure their authority before they can start behaving in that way. So it's a really interesting one. And there's also that weird, spinning it back to single combat, that idea of the usurper, for instance, being not just an experienced soldier and not just a successful general, but being successful in single combat. So that weird idea that we get even now about, you know, the individual commander has to be a good warrior themselves, as opposed to most of our generals today are not frontline troops themselves. And that was, if they were, it was in a very early part of their career, and they then moved on to command, where, you know, the idea that a commander would be involved in combat is a failure of their command structure, or a sign of the desperation of the circumstance. But the whole idea is, no, you don't get involved. You command. Don't. I was reading about Pyrrhus, one of the judgments of why Pyrrhus is one of the, so, you know, he's second only to Alexander, according to Hannibal. And one of the things they say about that is that when he is fighting in his cavalry, he doesn't lose sight of the larger battle. He knows what's going on elsewhere on his battlefield, even though he's engaged in combat himself. And that's recognized.
Which makes you wonder how he did that, because...
Yeah. Has he got, you know, runners telling him what's going on, or he's got a, you know, which is fascinating, because normally, of course, you're either involved and therefore you have no control, or you're not involved and therefore you can oversee what's going on in the battlefield. But it's that idea of the prowess of the individual as a fighter is something that's sort of connected to their ability to be a commander.
It's also a big part of the narrative that's being spun by our historians, in terms of coming back to the individual combat one-on-one. Another example of it is, of course, on the front page of this issue, is the reference to the Torquati, father and son, in terms of Roman tradition, where you've got in 461 BC, you've got Titus Manlius taking on this great towering Gaul at the river of the Anio. We've got this description by Livy whereby he's being called out one-on-one, and it is that opportunity for Roman to be shown to be greater than the barbarian. It's very Homeric in the way that he, with one swish of the shield, lifts his opponent's shield up and buries his sword underneath the shield into the breastbone. He has asked his general's permission before doing this to actually go out and face his opponent. But then, come 20 years later, when his son does it, it's a different situation. His son is out there as a front runner with the cavalry. He is engaging with the Latin cavalry and subsequently finds that he's up against people who, lo and behold, being Romans versus Latins, they know each other. And subsequently, it's a personal issue. It's part of the narrative that one-on-one they're going to settle their personal differences, show that who is greater. He succumbs to the risings of the Latins, saying, what will come with the commander arriving? Will you have to wait till that, or can you show yourself to be manly? Can you show your worth to us? And subsequently, he takes him on, arrives back at his father, puts down the Spolia in front of him to say what he has done, that he has done what he thought his father would want, to show that Rome is great. And his father subsequently enforces martial law on him, saying, you have stepped out of line. We have said that this is a severe situation where the Latins are fighting so similar to us. They will know every move. We can't be out of line. No man can step out of line. To do so is going to be tantamount to treason, and so subsequently imposes the death penalty on his own son. In terms of the one-on-one conflicts here, they are playing with the narrative that Livy or Diodorus Siculus wish to, impose upon the narrative.
I think it's interesting in that sense as well. Of that's used as a justification for patria potestas, and it's used as a military discipline. And the aftermath of that is that the army returns to its discipline so that Decimus Mus could perform devotio. So that it has a religious, that the ultimate aim is to perform the devotio to win the battle accordance with the god's message, and the actions of the son jeopardize that. And so the father puts the state above his family and therefore executes his son.
Well, he's putting the state above his family, he's putting the religion above his family, basically saying, already got Jupiter behind us. We don't need you going out there and being a show off to your mates because you've trained with these guys, you've grown up with these guys just because they're on the opposite side.
Yeah, there is a warning beforehand. Yeah, there is a warning before the single combat that don't engage, and then the son disobeys, rides into camp going, I've done this great deed, and the father goes, right, well, now I have to put you to death. Oh dear, that was, talk about expectations, blunted. Yeah, there's so much fascinating stuff about whether you had to be good at single combat. There's a discussion is it the Laches dialogue? I think it's the Laches dialogue, where Socrates is discussing with Laches and someone else whether you needed to be good at individual combat in a hoplite battle line, because hoplite battle is not about individual combat; it's about group combat. Therefore, and the sort of sentiment is because it's in the context of discussing the hoplomachoi, the skill teachers who are all charlatans. None of them are actually teaching you what you need to know. They're all claiming to, and then they're all crap. So the idea is, well, if it comes down to you against another individual, you're going to know what to do. And so that's not really a skill set, is the argument in the dialogue. It's knowing what to do in the phalanx. That's the skills. And so it's really interesting that, and I think one of the comments made is that the Spartans do not teach individual fencing skill. They only teach drill. And so, that idea of the individual combat is subsumed by you need to be a good unit fighter rather than a good individual fighter.
I would say that's where it sort of calls into question some of these accounts of the one-on-one conflict, because they do come across as such irregularities in the warfare. And I'll go back to that the Torquatus, the first Torquatus, when he's fighting against the Gaul. All of a sudden, you've got Livy describing him as taking up his Spanish sword, Gladius Hispaniensis, which actually didn't exist at the time. Then it all of a sudden turns into, I mentioned before, he executes this wonderful lifting of the shield, which is sort of tantamount to some of the illustrations that you come across in Mycenaean artwork, and the style of warfare that you hear about in Homer, of lifting a shield so you can get in close with a more of a rapier style sword to actually plunge in. Livius seems to be sort of hijacking this incident and imbuing it with so much of the Homeric world in order to bring that sort of the kudos with it as such to the Roman activities.
I think there's so many combat narratives, though, that do that. You look at the Battle of Marathon, the actual discussion of what are the armies doing is vague and really dissatisfying. And then rather than go into detail that we want discussed, we get individual combats highlighted within that battle, whether it be Callimachus or Appizelus or whoever else. And when you start to look at most baritone narratives, after generalized statements of armies and left wings and right wings and who was where, you do get individual exploits, all the way through to, right through to the Procopius is doing it in the 6th century. It's almost a patterning of the only way to make a battle account exciting is to actually dwell upon individual exploits rather than wings and formations exploits.
Same way in the movies nowadays.
Yeah.
Although I'm wondering if that is not different in the Principate. Of course, we don't have as many battle descriptions in that period anyway. It goes back to what Mark said, that we have this earlier period where all the descriptions are you have to be, to make a claim towards leadership, you have to be able to show the scars of single combat, and your skills as a general directly, or just your skills as a fighter have direct bearing on your perceived skill as a general. And then in the imperial era, that sort of seems to be gone. And I was thinking, maybe it's because Augustus himself isn't known exactly as a skilled general or a skilled fighter at all. In fact, even in the surviving sources, which we just said he might have dickered with the sources, even in the surviving sources, he doesn't exactly come off as the guy who goes ahead of his army and just like his adoptive father Julius Caesar. He is not shown up in the front line, grabbing a shield and encouraging his soldiers to take an extra step.
As I recall, Maximinus Thrax in the early 3rd century was remarkable for fighting in the front ranks with his soldiers, whereas previously that was not something that Marcus Aurelius or any of the other emperors had done. And in fact, now that I hear you mentioning Caesar picking up a shield and turning his soldiers around, that it was itself extraordinary of Caesar fighting in more or less going into battle armed in person. So for a good 2.5 centuries, I think the Romans realized that heroic style of leadership, of fighting, a general fighting in the front ranks, was inefficient and very dangerous, because if you lose your general, you might very well lose the battle. Much better to direct the battle from the rear lines. We could actually put in the reserve or something like that. Maybe things had changed, though, when you actually needed to garner the loyalty of your men, not simply on the basis of rank, but on the basis of the fact that you're one of them.
There's a weird sort of juxtaposition. I'm sure if Lindsay was here, he'd be telling us about Germanicus and Tiberius and others. But when you look at Vespasian, he's an experienced commander, not necessarily an experienced soldier. Whether it be on the Isle of Wight in the invasion under Claudius of Britain, or then in Judea. Similarly, Titus, they're present, and other figures like Domitius Corbulo are there, experienced commanders, but they're not necessarily fighting. But then you get, Marcus Aurelius, who's the most philosophical of emperors, and yet he's spends most of his reign fighting wars in Germany, but not as a soldier, as a commander. And then you get Trajan similarly, but you do get someone like Pertinax, who seems to be both a commander and a soldier, is elevated to the emperor and then assassinated very quickly because he's not an emperor, he's a soldier. And Thrax is the same, Julian is the same later in the 4th century. So there's a really bizarre juxtaposition of emperors who are not commanders, emperors who are commanders or have been commanders, but often causing dissatisfaction.
For the Principate and the early empire, you are talking about more of a palace administration, really, that's, in charge of these campaigns, and that they're not, as you say, directly threatened in terms of their positions with the outcome of one bad campaign. It's not like what comes to my mind is then looking in contrast at the Hellenistic period and saying the Wars of the Diadochi, where you've got individual commanders who are fighting, a lot of them, for their personal status and survival in a greatly changing situation across Alexander's former empire. And that's where you get that, what for me is a quintessential one-on-one but happening between Eumenes of Cardia, who of course is famously the little Greek general who has been for most of the time, the man who's carried a pen and book rather than a sword after Alexander along the campaign through Asia. And you've got him hanging on the coattails, if you like, of some of the early Diadochi, in particular Perdiccas, and then subsequently he goes into conflict against Neoptolemus, who to start with is on Perdiccas' side, but actually it then turns when he's ordered to follow the instructions of Eumenes. Now, whether it's a personal conflict there, whether he doesn't like the idea of this little Greek, coming in and, where he's doesn't belong, because of course people like Neoptolemus are themselves members of the Macedonian aristocracy. He's probably a member himself of the Molossian royal family of days gone by. So subsequently, you've got the two of them coming into conflict, and when they actually face each other in their second battle, because in the first battle where Eumenes wins, Neoptolemus gets away with about, I think, 400 men. Subsequently, they don't come into personal conflict. In the second one, when he comes back with his big bully Craterus to help him defeat Eumenes, and of course, on his side of the battle, he ends up coming face to face with Eumenes. You've got this wonderful image of the two of them seeing each other across the battlefield and deciding that's it, they're going to charge at each other and have it out, and in full charge, throwing themselves against each other, so much so that the swords go one way, spears go another. That all comes apart. They fall off their horses. They're writhing on the floor with each other in more of a death match of clawing at each other rather than really anything that resembles proper battle. And subsequently you have Eumenes ending up grabbing a sword and overcoming Neoptolemus with that. But on the other hand, just when he thinks that all is one and he can gloat over it, he then receives a quick shove by Neoptolemus with a dagger in his side that doesn't do him any harm in the long run, but it's that one-on-one antagonism that it plays well with the narrative, but it also is two individuals who are totally fighting for their careers and knowing that if they don't win that battle, never mind the armies that they've got, they won't follow them again, because they're showing that battle, they're showing the individual conflict is going to determine their career.
And the Diadochi, they all seem to have, they have the example of Alexander before them. Even several decades afterward, they all followed in his model, who he led from the front at all times. So the idea of one of them, these generals, actually going into single combat as they did, that doesn't strike me as being odd. I mean, it was not the most efficient thing to do. It was not wise to do. But it was maybe that for a Macedonian army, that's how you won the loyalty and affection of your soldiers. Because who among them really had a great claim to kingship to the heir, to be heir to the Alexander. I mean, you had to win, and you had to show your prowess as a warrior, and that meant you had to fight individually.
I think, Alexander's model of individual valor is a massive problem for the Hellenistic successors. They have to be like Alexander. They have to behave like he did, which suits some of them, like Pyrrhus, and not others.
It was also a huge problem for Alexander himself. I think that he suffered, what was it, 7 different wounds by the time he passed, and he probably had a collapsed lung from the arrow that he took in it during the Indian campaign. So
but
he
again,
was
all wounds in the front.
Bad shape.
All wounds in the front. So I don't think the wounds in the front model isn't credited to Alexander, but there is a Greek parallel to where the wounds are to the Roman ideal later, but they never connect the two. And it's a funny one, the whole idea of wounds in the front. You can't, like the Eumenes example, you can't control where you're wounded in the chaos of combat. You could have been fighting heroically and be stabbed in the back. That shouldn't reflect badly on you that someone stabbed you in the... It's like, gunfights. It's like, you shot him in the back. It's like, well, I had to win. So it's not like, it's this weird kind of like, oh, look, all my wounds are in the front. Well, except for those 2. Yeah, that was where a traitor tried to frag me. You're like, well, you're a bad fighter then. I'm like, I don't know that parallel works. So it's very much a literary model. I think that whole idea of, Roman senators stripping themselves naked and showing you all their scars in the front is more good luck than, look at me, I've only been wounded in the front.
And even the worst hostis of the Roman Republic, Catiline, can be redeemed in the eyes of his fellow past senators when they hear that in the last conflict that he fights, that all of his wounds are in the front. And subsequently, even though he's been trying to raise slave rebellions and burn Rome and, erase debts, etc., it's all forgiven as long as he... Yeah, but they like a good story. So
yeah. I mean, in a way, you get those incredible parallels, like the fencing masks with the gap to allow this fencing scar to occur, to show your personal prowess in individual combat, and therefore you are of a Prussian extraction, a commander, a great commander, and that sort of thing. Or even now, where the idea of a wing commander has to be good at dogfights themselves personally, not at the model of this is how we fight an air war. It's like, why is your individual ability as a dogfighter in any way relevant to you managing an air wing? So we're still with us in terms of the individual prowess of a commander. Somehow, if they are a proven individual commander, adds...
But the fighter pilot is not exactly ancient warfare, but a fighter pilot, of course, is a very individual warrior. I mean, it's him and his plane and maybe his wingman, and that's it. In that respect, he doesn't fight as much as a unit as most.
It's very, very Homeric in terms of the pairing of warrior and steward. The wingman and
yeah, I'm sure the wingmen like to be called steward.
Yeah. You're my charioteer. Exactly right.
And in some cases, the duel doesn't have to be, literally and physically the two of them going, head to head. I think, if you talk about rivals in ancient Greece, I would be thinking, Cleon and Brasidas would be, a classic pair of literary rivals that linked together and even in death. The demise of, we're talking about, stabbing in the back here, the wounds in the back as Cleon has turned and run from that gate opening at Amphipolis. They don't have to have come into conflict with each other for it to be portrayed as the great duel.
Well, also, of course, Cleon, fascinatingly, is not killed by a hoplite. He's killed by a peltast. Oh, the shame. The shame. Running away from a peltast. But I think that's the interesting thing, isn't it? You get the idea of individual combat by proxy by our armies fighting one another. And again, look at Alexander. Yes, he's leading the charge, and he is trying to kill Darius, but most of those battles are, in fact, proxy battles. You trying to kill the enemy king there's an army between you, and okay, you threw your spear at him, and just missed. But is that the same? Does that count as one-on-one combat, especially when one of you is not willing to fight? So it's a fascinating sort of aspect of it. When you look at the centerfold in the issue was on Siccius Donatus, so the most decorated Roman soldier, fighting 8 individual combats, participating in 9 triumphs, which is pretty fast. Wow. That idea of the individual combat as a pro, and he never rises above centurion. But there's also a point in some of the narratives, I think it's in Dionysius of Halicarnassus, he's a better general than the generals are. He's a better commander of troops. Problematically, he's given a cohort in 450, which is like, hang on, what? So the idea that the individual who leads by example as a better commander than corrupt generals who are political appointments, who are settling political scores, and especially in the conflict of the orders idea there, that you've got plebeians who are better for Rome than the patricians are. So that sort of sets up that whole narrative. But again, that idea of leadership, that leaders lead and dictators say go there. So that you still get that in management methodologies today about what is the better style of management. The idea that you're not going to ask your troops to do anything you couldn't do personally, and that you've demonstrated your ability to do that in the past, and therefore they will follow you. So that it's still with us, that sort of idea that if you've shown that you can do and fight individually, and Jasper earlier, just one step more, which is Epaminondas. Both Pelopidas and Epaminondas are in the front rank of the Theban sacred band at their famous victories, leading from the front in the middle. And obviously, especially Epaminondas at the Battle of Mantinea in 362, loses his life having won the victory. And the great story of when he's dying, all of his friends going, "Oh, but you've got no children." "Oh, I've got 2 daughters, Leuctra and Mantinea." A great sort of story. But the risk of having someone in the front rank fighting who is your general, dying and losing their life. Brasidas too. At the Battle of Amphipolis, there's only 7 Spartan casualties. 7. The Athenians lose 600, and one of those 7 is Brasidas. So, there's a risk to that.
There is. It's interesting that we're now talking about the relationship between single combat and commanders, but we haven't discussed champions very much, which is a whole different ball game, and it also doesn't show up in the issue because it doesn't seem to be as much of a thing in ancient history, even though it's one of those sort of, according to anthropologists, it's how warfare starts. You have 2 sides, and sort of the champions come forward, and they maybe, the bravest ones come and throw things or try to fight another brave one on their side. It's like,
it's funny because I think most people think David and Goliath as soon as you mention that, and it becomes a biblical slant on champion warfare. But there is, even when we're talking about Torquatus, the Gaul, stepping out in front of his army, he is a champion. He's not the commander of the Gauls. He's a towering Gaul who sticks out his tongue and shouts obscenities.
Come at me, bro. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, technically it's historical, so it's "cometh at me, my brethren, dost thou even hoist?" Yeah, I think that there is the champion. Obviously the Battle of the Champions through 556 BC. So there is the champion idea, and obviously in Achilles is a leader in his own right, but he's also a champion in the Homeric context. So there is the champion idea, but it gets subsumed into the leader idea, I suppose. And there's calls for champion warfare that get rejected. Most champion battles don't decide a battle. That they're framed that they should decide the battle, and then one side loses and they engage in the battle anyway and lose or win. It's one of those sort of like, well, but it didn't settle anything because you weren't going to abide by the outcome. of this battle. It's a fascinating proxy fight, and it's a weird. We do it. It's again, many of these sort of ideas are with us still in the way we sort of run our lives, even though most people are unaware of them. I don't know why, but Pokemon and Magic the Gathering just struck me that you've got this idea as well that you've got champion combat on your behalf to show that you are superior as a culture, and it's interesting how very seldom a champion combat actually resolves the combat because no one's willing to abide by the rules that you apparently were going to abide by.
The winner is presumably.
Well, the winner, yeah, but then even I think I'm probably getting it wrong. My biblical history is not as good as it should be. Even after the battle of David and Goliath, I think the Jewish army attacks the Philistines. Because they're so enthusiastic about their victory. Like, hang on, no, that's not what was meant to happen.
Is it? I forget if the introduction is that battle should decide the battle at all.
Yes, yeah, and then I think there's a follow-up. The enthusiastic winner versus the outraged defeated. So it's like, well, it didn't solve anything, did it? So yeah, I think it's an interesting one, and it's also, I think, the interesting from a Greek warfare perspective is where is the place of individual skill within a unit, and interestingly, that's true for Roman battle, and yet we get lots of individual single combats in Roman contexts where we want to concentrate, generally speaking, on unit warfare.
Well, the Romans did have awards that went to individual soldiers. For example, if you were the first over a rampart, like first over a wall, if you saved the life of a citizen. So they did recognize individual valor. I think that but as a matter of single combat, I don't think that was and that was the Spolia Opima. So a single combat, and that was a very rare circumstance where someone was going to actually slay the enemy general. So it would seem, though, with Spolia Opima, at least in the early portions of the Roman history, that it didn't. The status of the Roman warrior who defeated the enemy general was not as important as defeating the Roman enemy general. Whereas later on, it became very much you had to be the supreme commander, fighting under your own auspices and what have you. And I don't think I ever hear about Spolia Opima after Livy brings up the Marcus Licinius Crassus controversy. So it must have fallen by the wayside.
I think the whole conundrum of how the Romans deal with individual success is typified by when Caesar talks about Pullo and Varenus and their individual exploits on the Gallic frontier, and subsequently the question is whether to punish them for their outlandish behavior or reward them for it. And there's the two minds, because you've got to sort of balance what wants to be achieved in terms of military discipline, but at the same time the morale of the troops. And subsequently you've got that being a problem for not just the commander on the field, be in that case Caesar, but in terms of the I can't still keep coming back to the word narrative that's being put out there by the Roman sources to their Roman audience. Do you want to focus on that problem, or do you want to say, no, we'll consign that more to the realms of our legendary and historic battles, as Augustus does?
I think the Dona are interesting because they are individual exploits, but it's almost like they're created as a way of recognizing individual valor and exploits within a group context, because they are intended to be leadership examples. You're the first man on the wall. You're not the only man on the wall. You're not Alexander at Malea leaping in by yourself and, having to be rescued by your men. You're leading a maniple or a century or a cohort onto the wall. You're saving the life of a citizen because he's your fellow soldier. You're saving an army to get the grass crown. To get the naval crown, you are capturing an enemy ship. So these are not, yes, they're individual exploits, but they are individual exploits within a leadership context of a larger group.
And it's also very convenient when they're being given to somebody who's actually perished in the act.
Yes, Yes, yeah. Well, posthumous VCs don't come in until the Boer War, which is interesting. So there's a whole bunch of amazing exploits in the 19th century warfare which don't get Victoria Crosses because it's like, well, he died. So the fascinating thing, I think, with the individual exploit being contextualized, and you still get the donor under the Principate, because there is a framework whereby you've been the first man on the wall within the army, but the one that you can't contextualize is the Spolia Opima. It's like, oh no, that puts your individual context above and beyond the group. I can't have that because that makes the emperor look bad, and therefore we have to get rid of that. And so that's why it dies after Augustus. But the other donor are contextualized within an individual exploits for the larger army. And therefore you've got the idea of you can do these things provided that the context for them can be put more into the army and the state.
And those other awards still certainly it gave a reward. It rewarded bravery on the part of ordinary soldiers, which I think is a very smart thing to do. Whereas the Spolia Opima was just too big an honor to allow outside of the imperial household.
Well, it's the constant interplay, which we've talked about many times before, between the individual heroics and the discipline in the army, which we just discussed as well, between Manlius and the Dona. So it's all about being a hero while keeping your spot in the line. Balancing act. On that note, I think we're going to call it a day. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time.